It's finally happened. Call of Duty have started talking about matchmaking and how it works. And it's kind of interesting that they've almost rejected in the blog post that they released the idea of skill-based matchmaking and gone into quite a lot of detail about how it does work, as well as answering a lot of questions and kind of dispelling a lot of myths there are surrounding matchmaking. The blog post they released does point out at the very beginning that this information is only about multiplayer. But since the community's had the same kind of complaints and conspiracy theories and questions about matchmaking in multiplayer as they have in Warzone, I think it's still interesting to take a look at it, and it'll be interesting to see what they say when they eventually talk about how matchmaking works in Warzone. I'd kind of assume we probably won't be waiting too long for that one. As always, if you enjoyed this video, if you find it interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. So some of you might remember, a few weeks ago, I made a really long, like 40-minute video all about skill-based matchmaking and engagement-optimized matchmaking. And I said in that video, I don't know how it works, this is all speculation based on what I've seen and based on what makes sense. And I did a bunch of research into engagement optimized matchmaking and read the paper that idea was based on, where it was introduced. And my kind of conclusion from it was it probably doesn't work that well in something like Call of Duty. The paper's really talking about 1v1 games, and it says it could be adapted to work with sort of multi-team games or bigger teams, but that wasn't something that they were looking at. With Warzone, I just don't think it'd work at all. But with multiplayer, I could imagine how maybe it could work. But anyway, go watch that video if you want all the details on that. So for this one, for the blog post, the explanation that they've posted, they start off with this diagram where it's got 8 kind of factors that go into matchmaking for a lobby. And it says at the beginning, skill is just one of those 8 factors. It's not the main one. It's not the most important thing at all, but it is definitely considered. The 8 factors are connection, time to match, skill and performance, platform, voice chat, input device, recent maps and modes, and playlist diversity. And there's a few things in here that I hadn't really thought about that much, like matching based on whether people have voice chat or not, although that does kind of make sense. But also, I don't think any of these are huge surprises. Like, the 3 things I ended up saying in my video were probably the biggest things were connection, time to match, and skill and performance. And that definitely seems to sort of correlate with what they're saying in this blog post. The first part of it says, connection, as the community will attest, ping is king. Connection is the most critical and heavily weighted factor in the matchmaking process. And this just makes sense to me. Like, it's so obvious if I play with someone in a different region, like I play with someone in America, or I play with someone in like South Africa or in Asia or Australia, that I have a completely different experience, which implies to me overall the matchmaking is always trying to match me with someone in my region. Even if I'm playing at kind of peak times for Asia or I'm playing at peak times for the US, it will still try to put me in games that are in Europe. I have heard of other people, like Saw Fireborn was tweeting earlier about the idea that maybe he's put in different games, you know, he's put in games with other people. I think in Warzone it could easily be a little bit sort of looser, maybe, like a little bit more widespread, just because you need to fill a lobby with 100 people, which is much harder than finding like 10 people or 12 people for a multiplayer game. But they've said it clearly here, and I don't really have any reason to doubt it, that connection is the most important thing. And the second thing is the thing that I think is the most important, and something that I thought lots of people kind of overlooked when they were talking about matchmaking in all of the discourse about this over the last couple of years. The time to match, how long it takes you to find a game. I've been consistently impressed with matchmaking and how fast it finds a game. So I was assuming that if it doesn't find a game within like 30 seconds, within a minute or so, it starts rapidly broadening its parameters just to try and get you in any game rather than have you waiting around not doing anything. Maybe I notice this a bit more than other Call of Duty content creators because I play loads of different games. And there's loads of other games where when you're playing them, like I've said before, like StarCraft, Heroes of the Storm, where it will take quite a long time to match you up against other opponents, even if it's just trying to match you up against one other opponent, because it's probably thinking a lot more about things like skill level. In something like Warzone or in multiplayer, you just seem to get in games almost instantly. And that obviously is partly explained by the fact there's tons of people playing Call of Duty at any given time, but also I think it's just that the game prioritizes it, and that's what they've said in this blog. So the two most important factors in the matchmaking Call of Duty multiplayer are connection and how long you've been waiting for a game. And that completely makes sense. It's something that they can do regardless of who's playing. They can always just try their best to match you up with as good a connection as possible and then try to get you in a game as quickly as possible. That makes complete sense. And then all of the other things, the other 6 factors, are kind of grouped up together as things that are nice to have. Like, if there's enough people playing with a good enough connection to you, so enough people around the same server that you would have the best connection to, and you haven't been waiting too long, then it will start considering the other things. So these are all things that I would assume are only going to be really considered in peak times when there's loads of people playing, or in super popular playlists. So multiplayer, obviously things like domination and team deathmatch, it can probably do these kind of things. If you're playing one of the slightly stranger sort of playlists, one of the playlists that not many other people play, then you're probably not going to be using these things for the matchmaking in your lobbies. And those things are the playlist diversity, so the number of playlists that are available, recent maps and modes, so which maps have you played in recently, like they don't really want to just put you in a game in the same map if you're in a playlist where there's lots of maps, skill and performance, so they do try to get you into a game, it says there, the opportunity to have an impact in every match, so they want you to be in a game where you're not going to get completely trashed, but also not a game where it's just a given that you're going to win. Your input device, so if you're on controller, you're more likely to be up against controller players, and this is something that people have known for ages is a big deal. And if you're on mouse and keyboard, you're up against mouse and keyboard players. Obviously, sometimes they're mixed up, especially if you have a group of friends who are playing together and some on controller and some on mouse and keyboard. Platform, so if you're on PC or if you're on console, it will try to match people up on PC against PC or console against console, unless it can't do that because there's not enough people. And then voice chat, because obviously if you're using voice chat a lot, if you've got voice chat enabled, you probably want to be on a team with other people that have voice chat on. If you've got voice chat disabled, you probably don't care, so you'll get grouped up with other people that don't care. All of that stuff sounds perfectly reasonable to me. And then in the blog post, they go on to go into a little bit more detail about all of these. So for connection, they say connection is the most important part of the online Call of Duty experience. And it talks about delta ping, so basically the difference in round trip time of the data between your best data center and the data center onto which your lobby has been placed. And they always try to get you so that delta is kind of as low as possible. So you have the best possible experience because your information's kind of being routed through the shortest possible distance or the shortest time, so you're going to have the best connection. And it does say here something that I think is super important. They can't completely eliminate it. I've done videos about this in the past, that you can't completely eliminate lag. All games deal with lag differently, but there's a problem with like the actual speed of light, let alone worrying about sort of old hardware and rubbish connections and stuff like that. No matter how good your connection is, the speed of light is actually going to start becoming a factor at some point in how fast you can send information to the server and how fast that server can get information back to you. So they can't ever completely eliminate lag and things like that, but they can mitigate it. So sometimes they do things like prediction, where they guess where other people are, and then the server guesses where you are, and that can lead to those kind of weird moments where you feel like you get shot around a corner, or where you think you've shot someone but you haven't actually managed to hit them. And it can do stuff like rollback, so maybe if you feel on your game you shot someone and that bullet connected, but then the server says, oh no, actually you were dead, but we just hadn't told you you were dead yet, that bullet is kind of taken back, so you don't get the kill, you don't do the damage that you thought you did. Those kind of things feel like they suck, but it's kind of the best option they have. Other games do things in different ways. So, you know, Halo does a lot more prediction, and it also does a lot less rollback. So that means that sometimes you get crazy desync in Halo, and you get lots and lots of situations where two people kill each other at exactly the same time, because it's counted all of the shots, whether you were dead or not, because your client said that you shot. And that means that someone who you've killed can actually keep on shooting for a split second and possibly finish you off too. There's a really interesting bit in the time to matchmaking section where they talk about the fact that if wait time is too long, people often will cancel out and then restart it, and that causes problems for them because obviously there's a whole process where it's trying to match you in a lobby. You know, maybe you're kind of half in a lobby waiting until everyone's ready to get put in the same lobby together, and then you back out and that ruins that lobby. Or in multiplayer, they talk about the rustment playlist, where it's Rust and Shipment, that everybody wants Shipment, so lots of people go into Rust, back out immediately. That causes a gap that has a priority kind of marker on it to fill it up, because they don't want people playing in a game where half their team is left. And that means you're more likely to get put into a match on Rust to fill in the spaces of all the people that left a Rust match than you are to get into a fresh game of Shipment. So that's a kind of problem they have to deal with. When they talk about skill, they are a little bit more vague. They say it's based on your overall performance, so kills, deaths, wins, losses, and more, including the modes you play, your recent matches, as well as a kind of more overall view across your entire multiplayer experience, and it's constantly updating and reacting. And they say it's not only a factor when you're matched against enemies, but also teammates. So, you know, if you're a certain level, you probably want to play with people that are a similar level to you, even if sometimes it doesn't feel like that. And it says there that, you know, Call of Duty 4 had skill-based matchmaking in it. It was something that was considered all the way back then. And then there's a paragraph that I think is super important, so I'll put it up on screen for a bit. I've seen people tweeting about this, and I think misinterpreting it. They're saying that there's a really important sort of mission to try and make sure the disparity between the most skilled players and the least skilled player isn't too vast, because then both of those players might feel like it's a waste of time. So they said their data clearly indicates that inclusion of skill into matchmaking increases the variety of outcomes experienced by players of all skill levels. So in other words, all players, regardless of skill level, are more likely to experience wins and losses more proportionately. Now, I've seen some people saying, oh, well, that's just manipulating you. That's just putting you in games where you're going to win or you're going to lose and you don't have a say in the outcome. I don't think that's what it's saying at all. It's just saying if you're put up against people who are as good as you, you're more likely to have a kind of 50-50 chance of winning or losing. Whereas if you're just in a random pool, if you're an above average player, you've got a much, much, much higher chance of winning. And everyone else, all of the kind of normal players, have a much, much, much lower chance of winning. So then you end up in a kind of situation where some people just lose all the time and some people just win all the time. And I know some people are going to hear that and think, well, then they should just get good at Call of Duty. If you've put in the time, you've put in the energy to practice the game, then you should win more often than people who don't. But I think that's a kind of ridiculous view of a video game. Like, this is something where some people, and I would argue normal people, probably play for a couple of hours a week. And then some people play 10 hours a day. Those people are definitely going to be much better than the people who only play occasionally. I don't think it's fair to say, if you don't play Call of Duty 10 hours a day, you don't deserve to win games. And on the other extreme, the people who play 10 hours a day, if they were just winning every single game without any effort being put in, then they're going to get bored of the game pretty quickly and probably stop. I saw that a little bit with the X-Defiant beta. Like, one of the X-Defiant betas, I can't remember which one it was, I was playing with Jaff, and there's no skill-based matchmaking in that. They've made a big deal of how skill isn't considered in lobbies. And we just won match after match after match. It was unbelievably easy just to steamroll every team we were against. And I kind of got bored. And that was the only session I played on that beta, because it was like, oh, what's the point? I'm just going to win every single game. I know if you don't win every game, it sounds nice, the idea of winning all the time, but I just don't think the reality plays out that way. And this section goes on to say, their data shows that when lower skill players are consistently on the losing end, they're likely to quit matches in progress or stop playing altogether. That has an effect on a player pool because there's a smaller player pool, which means wait times get longer and connections aren't as strong as they should be. That can compound over time to create a spiral effect, and I've talked about that loads. You know, the idea, if all the people who are bad at the game don't enjoy the game and stop playing, the average skill level gets higher and higher and higher, so more and more people drop out of the game because they can't keep up, and then you end up with a smaller and smaller group until you only end up with like the most elite hardcore players still playing it, and then nobody new ever wants to play the game. There's a kind of interesting sentence towards the end of this that says, we also understand that many high skill players want more variety of experience, but often feel like they only get the sweatiest of lobbies. We've heard this feedback clearly and will continue to test and actively explore ways to mitigate this concern. This is probably the closest I think this entire blog post gets to kind of fluff, because the people are talking about, the high skill players who want more variety but feel like they only get the sweatiest of lobbies, that's just people who play the game a huge amount, people who play a lot and are very good at the game, maybe people who have been playing for years or just people who are very talented, saying they want to be able to beat people who are worse than them. And I just don't think that's fair on all of the other people in those games, especially in something like Warzone, but even in something like multiplayer, it just seems unfair. So then it goes on to say they are developing a ping and matchmaking white paper, like a document, just giving you some real information about how it works, which will be interesting. But then there's a kind of frequently asked questions bit, and I really like this because I think it directly addresses a lot of the sort of conspiracy theories that people have had about matchmaking. It's nice to have an official word on how this works, and I believe them. Like, I'm not saying that because I think I'll get in trouble with Activision if I don't. I just genuinely think this is true. I don't see why they would talk about it if they were lying. Like, they wouldn't lie about it. I think they would just not mention it at all. So, let's go through these fairly quickly. Number 1, does Call of Duty consider player engagement or time played as a factor in matchmaking? We do not consider how often or how much you play when determining matchmaking. So that straight away is saying all of that engagement optimized matchmaking thing about trying to get you to play for as long as possible, because that's what engagement optimized matchmaking was all about. That paper that introduced the idea before someone says, oh, it's actually about getting you to buy stuff or whatever. The paper that introduced the idea of engagement optimized matchmaking was all about trying to prevent people from stopping playing and trying to make people play for as long as possible. So they said they do not consider how often or how much you play when determining matchmaking, so they are not doing engagement optimized matchmaking. They're trying to, by the sounds of it, make it as enjoyable as possible and make it so you do keep wanting to play the game kind of, over time, but they're not trying to get you to kind of keep playing for 5 hours at a time or something like that. Number 2, does the Call of Duty matchmaking process impact any in-game elements such as hit registration, player visibility, aim assist, damage, etc.? No, our matchmaking process does not impact gameplay elements. So that should put to rest all of those conspiracy theories about, oh, my gun does less damage because I'm a better player, or I have less health or something, or I have less aim assist because I'm good at the game. Like, that's a load of nonsense. That's just people making excuses or seeing patterns in things that just aren't there. Number 3, does spending money on Call of Duty content such as bundles, battle pass or black sale change how players are matched? Money spent does not in any way, shape or form factor into matchmaking. So no, if you buy a bundle, you're not then going to get easier lobbies or something like that. Number 4, does Call of Duty use bots in multiplayer matchmaking? Call of Duty multiplayer does not use bots as part of the general matchmaking process. If this changes in the future, we will inform the community. So in multiplayer, there are no bots. It'll be interesting to see if they have that same question in the Warzone one, because I know there's some people saying they think they've seen bots in Warzone. Personally, I've never seen any. I've never seen video of anything that I thought was definitely a bot, but they've said at least in multiplayer, they aren't using any. Number 5, do partners or content creators get special consideration in general matchmaking? No, we do not change the matchmaking process based on who owns the account. In specific cases, such as for events like Call of Duty Next, we may be required to customize how lobbies are formed. However, these events usually take place in private matches and do not impact general matchmaking. So I can give a little bit of a perspective on what they're talking about there. At Call of Duty Next, we were playing on a different version of the game. It was actually running online, like we were playing online against other people in the same building, which was a bit weird. It wasn't really running as a LAN. It was very, very strange. But I think what they're talking about there, about how they manipulated the matchmaking, is that to make sure there were lots of full games and we didn't have to like wait for everyone to finish before we started another one, they would add in lots and lots of kind of QA testers who were playing with us. So I think what they wanted to do was to try and make sure real players were matched up with each other. So real players would be matched up playing alongside other real players, but then a lot of the enemy teams would be made up of QA testers, rather than kind of splitting them up so everyone had QA testers on their team. The next one, have you ever considered an opt-in or opt-out system for the matchmaking algorithm? Our data suggests that splitting the player base with opt-in, opt-out matchmaking will have negative consequences on the overall player pool. And this is something I've heard from lots of developers, that the player pool is actually surprisingly fragile. And every time they split it by like introducing a new mode or introducing a new kind of map into Warzone or something like that, it has a massive effect on everything else. So I think they're quite reluctant to do anything that splits the player pool. So it said that means potentially longer wait times based on type matchmaking, plus add into that playlist map and mode history, platform and more, and you end up with matches with poor connections. Now, I think maybe the most interesting one out of all of these, have you ever tested removing skill as a consideration from matchmaking? So have they ever tried just removing skill-based matchmaking entirely to see what would happen? It says, we have run tests over the years to determine if removing skill as a consideration from matchmaking makes sense. We will continue these tests periodically. To date, the data remains consistent with what we detailed above. players tend to quit matches or stop playing if they're getting blown out, resulting in a negative overall experience for all players in the lobby and the general player population. We purposefully do not disclose when these tests occur because it may impact feedback or the data we see during these tests. So that's super interesting. They're kind of saying, you know, if they announced, hey, we're doing a week without skill-based matchmaking, I'm sure there would be lots of people that would be like, yeah, this was amazing, this was the best I've ever done in Call of Duty. But then if they don't tell anyone that they're doing that, then people play and like they do one of these tests where they turn off skill-based matchmaking and everyone's like, oh, skill-based matchmaking feels really harsh, I'm in loads of games where I'm not having any fun. And then they quit playing. They can be like, oh yeah, people just don't like the idea of skill-based matchmaking, but the, you know, the reality of it is kind of different. They seem to be saying when they remove it, people's experiences of the game are worse. And then finally, they say, have you considered removing skill from matchmaking in specific general multiplayer game modes? We have considered this in the past and we will continue to examine if this idea makes sense as part of an experimental playlist or in specific modes. We have nothing to announce on that front today. This one's a little bit weird because I kind of think, at least in Warzone, and I know this blog post isn't talking about Warzone, it does feel like they don't have skill-based matchmaking in some of the limited time modes. Now, multiplayer I don't play enough of to really recognize the difference. I don't know if the limited time modes have skill-based matchmaking or not, but it's kind of interesting that here it sounds like they haven't tried that yet. So, overall, an absolute ton of information, a ton of, I think, very direct answers. I've seen a few people on social media saying, oh, there's a load of nothing in this, it's just fluff. I think this is very direct. They've said exactly kind of what they're not doing in response to lots of things that people have accused them of doing. And I don't really see, like I said earlier, why they would lie. Why would they go to the trouble of lying? Because then, obviously, all it takes is one disgruntled ex-employee, of which there's like 1,900 of right now, to come out and say, oh, well, actually, I coded a system that does the exact opposite of what they just said. And then that would make them look terrible, and everyone would distrust everything they say from now on. It would be easier for them to just say nothing at all. So I think, if you think about it, this is probably true. So let me know in the comments what you think about it. I think this is really interesting, but it does kind of just reinforce what I already said I thought was happening. So, you know, I feel a little bit smug about that too. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Goodbye.
Stay locked and loaded.